In Chapter 14 of our study of introductory economics, we're going to take a look at some of the macroeconomic challenges that we face. In this chapter, we're going to take a close look at the macroeconomic challenges of unemployment, inflation, and poverty. So let's get started. And the first thing we'll look at is that challenge of unemployment. Now, the topics of unemployment, inflation, and poverty are not very funny subjects, but as I start our conversation here on unemployment, let me at least try some gallows humor to start out. It's been said that if my friend loses his or her job, it's an economic downturn. If a family member of mine loses his or her job, it's considered a recession. And if I or you lose your job, it's a depression. All joking aside, let me give you some serious advice with regard to unemployment. First, in today's global economy, the odds on it happening to you, meaning you becoming unemployed at some point in your working lifetime, is pretty high. The majority of times when this is going to happen, it's not a reflection on your work. So don't let your ego get in the way. And the reason I say that is you need to claim your benefits, your unemployment benefits, because you've paid dearly, will have paid dearly for them. In our study, we're going to consider 4 types of unemployment. Here's the first. It's called frictional unemployment. People in this category are people who take time off before they search for work. A second category is called seasonal. These are people who are out of work when an industry slows or shuts down due to seasonal trends. Now, it's important to understand that the government, meaning the federal government, well, and states to a large degree too, but primarily the federal government does not take action to try to prevent these forms of unemployment. The third classification of unemployment is called structural unemployment. And this occurs when people's skills wind up not matching the jobs that are available, usually as a result of an industry change or a market being eliminated and new markets being created. There are also 5 major causes for this. First, the development of new technology, which we've seen how that changes markets dramatically. Second, the discovery of new resources. That has the same type of impact in many ways on markets that technology does. The third cause of structural unemployment can be from changes in consumer demand, which also change markets. Globalization can have an impact on structural unemployment as jobs move from one place to another. And as new requirements for new markets come about, education shortages or availability to education to change the skills may help contribute to the structural unemployment as well. The fourth category of unemployment is called cyclical unemployment, and this occurs during normal economic downturns in our economy. And it's these last 2 types of unemployment, structural and cyclical, that the government does take action on to alleviate through programs and other means. Let's now take a look at how we go about measuring unemployment. And there are 5 parts to this. Fundamentally, we got to start with the census of the American public. A census is an official count of the population. And from the census, we can get that labor force calculation or figure that we talked about in Chapter 10, roughly the 150 million people that are actually potential participants in the labor force. Then we can start to calculate what's called the unemployment rate. And what the unemployment rate is the percentage of that labor force that is unemployed. Now I have here acceptable at 4 to 6%. The general thought is that the economy is functioning well and the government doesn't have to be concerned with the unemployment rate if the unemployment rate hovers within a range of 4 to 6%. After 6% is when the government starts to take a look at the unemployment rate and to put programs in place or supports to try to bring it down. Now, there is a concept that's called full employment. And full employment is considered the level of employment that's reached when no cyclical unemployment exists. And that would bring the unemployment rate down to approximately about 3%. And the question is, does that ever happen? And quite frankly, it does. Most recently, during the latter part of the 1990s, when amidst the high-tech boom and the information revolution, unemployment got down to the 3% level, and we had a period of full employment for quite a few years. The next concept in the efforts to measure unemployment is the classification of people who are working at a job for which they are overqualified or working part-time. And that's what we call or classify these people as underemployed. The next measurement concept is the discouraged worker. And this concept really highlights one of the flaws in the way we actually calculate the unemployment rate. Discouraged workers are workers who have stopped searching for employment. And this usually happens during the very deep recessions or an actual depression. And most recently, it happened during the recovery period from the 2008 Great Recession. And there was great debate raised again over how we calculate unemployment because the recession has taken quite a long time to recover from. And many workers dropped out of looking for work because there was just none available. And when that happens, the government actually stops counting people in the unemployment rate. If you may recall back in Chapter 10 when we talked about how unemployment is considered a little bit, that you have to be actively looking for a job, or if you've dropped off the unemployment insurance benefit rolls, the government loses sight of you. So quite often you'll hear people say the unemployment rate, let's say if it was 7 or 8%, is probably higher than that in actuality because of the topic of discouraged workers, and that there are some people that who would like to work but have stopped looking for work. The general train of thought here and what people are suggesting is that we should change the way the unemployment rate is calculated and base it on the total number of people that actually have a job, either working part-time or full-time, against the total labor force figure, that approximate 150 million. That would give a truer picture of what the unemployment rate is within the country. Let's now move on to take a look at the concept of inflation. And we'll do this similar to the way we did with unemployment, in that we'll look at the different types of inflation that there are and also how we go about measuring them. And as we traditionally do, let's start with giving you a working definition, in this case for inflation. Inflation is a general increase in prices, and the inflation rate is the change in prices over time. Now, there are three theories about what causes inflation, what causes an increase in prices. And here's the first. It's called the quantity theory, and it relates to the amount of money that is circulating in the economy. The quantity theory states that too much money exists in the economy. Now, we know from our principles of supply and demand, when you increase the supply of something to a market, in this case money to the economy, that the value or the price of something comes down, okay, as the supply increases. Well, in this case, we're relating it to, as the supply of money increases, the value of the money decreases. So therefore, to acquire goods and services, it takes more money to do that. Therefore, that will increase prices for goods and services. So you need to make that connection between the increase in money into the economy, which devalues the value of the money, and that leads to an increase in prices. It takes more money to acquire goods and services, and it's the increase in prices that's the inflation. Here is the second theory about what causes inflation, and once again, we go back to our principles of supply and demand. It's called the demand pull theory, and it simply states that inflation occurs when demand for goods and services exceeds the existing supplies. And we've seen how this works in our study of supply and demand. We have lots of people running after fewer supplies of goods and services leads to a price increase. The third theory about what causes inflation is also related to our principles of supply and demand. It's the other side of the coin. It's called the cost push theory. And this theory states that inflation occurs when producers raise prices in order to meet increased costs. Higher prices, particularly for raw materials and wages. Now, the wage increases is probably the most common for the cost, relating to the cost push theory. And when this happens, if it continues over a period of time, can be very debilitating or damaging to an economy, because it leads to what we call a wage price spiral. One begets the other, and it's very difficult to break that cycle and that spiral. Labor expects wage increases, and then employers have to raise prices of products, which makes the cost of living for the population higher, which makes workers go back to their employers and again ask for wage increases to be able to live to meet the prices that are being asked for goods and services in the marketplace. Once a wage price spiral starts to take effect, it's very difficult to break and can be very debilitating. Okay, let's move on to taking a look at the three types of inflation. And the first type we'll consider is what we call creeping inflation. And what creeping inflation is a steady and predictable increase in prices of usually a small 1 to 3% a year that typically doesn't cause problems for either consumers or businesses, because it can generally be planned for and doesn't have that great an impact. The second type of inflation is called chronic inflation, and just like a chronic disease, if you will, we have a substantial and steady month-to-month increase in prices. So it's steady and it's substantial. And this makes it particularly difficult for business to operate, because they can't effectively plan for what their expenses are going to be able to produce goods and services. The third type of inflation is very serious, and it's the thing that most business people, economists, government officials, and general population fears the most. It's called hyperinflation. This is when prices soar far out of control for long periods of time, and your money system loses much of its value. and it usually leads to a country's economic collapse and is very serious and is very difficult to break. Now let's move on from here and take a look at the effects of inflation. Here's the first thing to consider. Inflation of any type works towards reducing purchasing power. And what we mean by that, by purchasing power, is the ability to purchase goods and services. The next effect, that inflation erodes income, is very closely tied to the first effect that we just talked about, the reduction in purchasing power. Inflation erodes income, particularly if real income for individuals remains the same. For example, it's really damaging to retired or disabled people who are on what we call fixed incomes, where their income doesn't change at all over time. And when you have the cost of living going up because of the price increases resulting from inflation, it makes it very difficult to live because you can, in many cases, not purchase the same number or same types of goods and services that you need or have in the past. The next effect to talk about is the fact that inflation discourages savings, particularly if the inflation rate is higher than the interest rates that are being paid. And let me give you a simple example. I mean, this is simple math concepts here. Let's say the inflation rate was 8%, and money that you can put in a bank is only going to get 4% interest paid on it. Obviously, you're losing 4% if you don't wind up spending the money or using the money in the short term. So when you have an inflation rate that is higher than the interest rates on investments being currently offered, you'll see that people will increase their spending to use the money before it loses its value. And this is very similar to the wage price spiral in that once that starts with the discouraging of savings, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that it's very hard to break and get people to put money in a bank and not spend it and not continue to fuel the inflation rate. In talking about the effects of inflation, I've pretty much focused on negative effects. And the negative effects are the overwhelming majority of what happens with regard to inflation. However, there are rare occasions where inflation for short periods of time actually wind up helping people, governments, businesses, and the like. So let's stop here for a second and take a quick look at some examples of who might gain or is hurt by inflation. And here's our first example. We have a situation where, let's say, inflation surges to 7%, and a person has a 5% fixed rate mortgage that they're making payments on. Now, your key here in trying to figure out, is the person that has the mortgage being hurt or do they gain by inflation? And the key to this is to consider the 7% inflation rate. That's what the bank has to deal with, meaning the mortgage holder. And their money, if you will, in current terms, is increasing in terms of the value and prices around it at 7%. But the person who has the obligation to the bank only has a 5% obligation regarding the money and the payments. So in this case, the person who has the mortgage gains from inflation because they're paying off their obligation at dollars that are actually worth less. So they're ahead in this particular case. Let's look at another one. Here we have a retired business professional that depends on supplemental income from stock dividends. Now, we talked about dividends from stock back in Chapter 13. You know, that's kind of like an interest payment, and usually it's fairly consistent over time. So let's say in this case, The dividends go up on average about 2 or 3% based upon the company's profits, but inflation is running at 5 or 6%. So what's the value, or what impact does the inflation have on the value of the stock dividends? And if the inflation rate is higher than the growth in the dividends, the retired business person will wind up being hurt by the inflation rate. A third example, here we have a state government that receives revenue from fixed rate license fees, like for contractor's license, or even something as simple as the Department of Motor Vehicles and what they charge for driver's license renewals, fixed rate license fees. Now, state government has expenses as well, everything from what they pay state employees in terms of wages to what it costs them to maintain public services, roads and the like. And if we have an inflation rate that is, let's say 5, 6, 7, or 8%, where prices to pay people that work for the state government or to have work done for supplies to build roads and so forth, if the prices are going up, but their revenue coming in is at a fixed rate and doesn't change, it's very similar for the government to being on like a fixed income. And we know what effect that has on the government in this case, and that they'd be hurt by the inflation because of the fixed revenue. Here's an interesting question to think about. What effect would a low unemployment rate have on inflation? Now stop here for a second and think. Low unemployment rate means that lots of people are employed, they're getting paid, and they have disposable income in their pockets to spend on goods and services. Well, in that situation, you would expect that there would be, over time, price increases as demand for goods and services would be robust because of the low unemployment rate. Hopefully, you would experience creeping inflation rather than chronic or hyperinflation in this type of case. Now, in chapters 15 and 16, we're going to be looking at some tools for measuring overall economies, but also some subsets of that, and we'll introduce you to a tool that's called the Phillips curve, which shows the relationship between employment/unemployment and inflation. Next concept that I'd like to introduce you to here is the concept of deflation, which I think you could probably figure out is the opposite side of inflation. It's a sustained decrease in overall price levels. And to give you an example of what that might look like is for the better part of the past 15 to 20 years, as a result of the globalization of the world's economies that has in part been driven by the information revolution, we've had an explosion of goods and services becoming available worldwide that, if you know your principles of supply and demand, when you increase supply and options for consumers, you're going to have a decrease in terms of price levels. Now, that has occurred, and we have had a period of general deflation, or low prices and lowering of prices. The reason that we have not had a bout with inflation as a result of that is because up until really the 2009 period, the money supply has been fairly well managed and has been held in check. So we've been able to reap the benefits from globalization and the information revolution, having more goods and services which has lowered to choose from, which has lowered prices in general. Let's now spend a couple of moments looking at how inflation is measured. And it's measured using indexes. And let me give you a working definition for an index, or particularly a price index. A price index is a measurement that shows the average price of a standard group of goods over time. And the world's most famous, or at least here in the United States, famous index is the Consumer Price Index, commonly referred to as the CPI. It's an index that's computed each month by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that's a federal government agency, that measures the price of a standard group of consumer goods and services. This group of goods and services is called the market basket by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it generally includes things like the following: food and drinks, housing, apparel and upkeep, meaning clothes and the sundry products for your personal upkeep, transportation costs, cost of medical care, entertainment, any education costs, communications costs, and some other services periodically that are changed in and out that are a little bit more minor to these others that we've highlighted here. The inflation rate is determined by calculating the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and it's actually pretty simple math. Based upon that market basket that is analyzed on a monthly basis, and we add up the prices for as to what it costs to acquire those goods and services, we do the following with regard to that price information. The first thing is that there is a base period price that is set for that market basket. For example, let's just say hypothetically that the base period price that for all those goods and services was determined 2 years ago, and we use that figure and we plug it in the denominator of this fraction. And then with the current month's cost or prices for that market basket, we use as the updated cost. And then we figure out the percentage change. So if we use an example, let's say that market basket 2 years ago cost us $150, and in the current month we find that it costs us $165. The simple math tells us is that over that 2-year period, based upon what we're seeing this month, we have a increase in the pricing by 10%, so we would say the inflation rate is 10%. But it's pretty simple math. Since I have now introduced you to how the inflation rate is calculated, and also introduced the consideration of a measurement over time, it's time for us to help define for you some really important concepts with regard to business and economic measurements, and define some terms for you. And the concepts and terms that we're going to define here are real and nominal, and I'm going to use it as it relates to inflation. Now, these terms, real and nominal, are most commonly used to clarify values of economic growth and wages and interest rates. And going forward in chapters from here, we will refer to these quite often in terms of comparing measurements, real and nominal measurements. And the term nominal refers to present year information. And present year information, nominal statistics, are not good for using for trends because they're short term, okay? It's the contrary to the idea of a trend over time. And when we refer to real measurements, we're referring to measurements that are adjusted for the effects of inflation and are based upon a base year, like we just did in the example in calculating the inflation rate. So real statistics are the ones that we use for trends and to make some really solid predictions about things, as opposed to nominal, which is current year and short-term type of measurements. Now we'll move on to the third major topic and third major economic challenge that we'll look at in this chapter, and that being poverty. How we measure it, what can be done about it, and so forth. Again, as we traditionally do when we move on to a new topic, is we need to do some foundation setting and look at some definitions. Poverty is defined by the government from a family perspective, and therefore we need to clarify some very key definitions here so that we know what we're talking about. First, a family in the eyes of the government. Family is defined as a group of two or more people related by either birth, marriage, or adoption who share the same housing unit in terms of their living arrangements. However, a family should not be confused with the government's definition for what a household is, which is used for some other measurements. And the government defines a household as all people who live in the same housing unit, regardless of how they're related. Understanding those two definitions, we can now actually provide you with a definition of poverty. And the government defines it this way. As a family, poverty is defined as a family whose total income is less than the amount required to satisfy the family's, not the households, but the family's minimum needs. Now, here are two additional terms and concepts relating to poverty, and be very careful here in making sure you understand the nuances between these two and how they relate to what I've given you so far about families, households, and the actual definition of poverty. The first one is the poverty threshold that's defined by the government. The poverty threshold varies, meaning when a family would enter or be considered to be living in poverty. It varies with the size of the family, and that makes some sense. It's the income level below which the income is insufficient to support the family. Obviously, if you have a family of 10, the requirements from an income standpoint to support it are far greater than a family of 4 or 5, let's say. Now, the second concept here is the poverty rate. The poverty rate is the percentage of people who live in a household with income below the poverty threshold. So here what the government is doing in defining the poverty rate in the country is extending the net, if you will, past the family to also the other members that might be living in the same household that are not directly part of the immediate family. So that's how the government defines poverty rate. Next, we're going to take a quick look at the factors that seem to play a part in poverty, and there are 7 of them. The first of which is not going to surprise anybody. It's a lack of education. Median income data shows that a high school dropout earns at just above the poverty threshold for a family of 4. A number of times during our study this year, we have taken a look at the value of education to a person's earning potential. And the higher the level of education, the greater the earning potential, and therefore the further you can remove yourself potentially from poverty. The second factor is location. And there's 2 things to consider about location. First, if you're in a location where there are no jobs available, you run the risk of putting yourself into a poverty type of condition. Secondly, with regard to location, is cost of living. There are some places in our country, particularly in the cities, where the cost of living is much higher than other places. If you combine, for example, the cost of living with a lack of education, it's kind of like a double whammy and could really have an impact on you. Third factor, unfortunately, racial discrimination. And thank goodness that this is becoming less so, but it will still always potentially play a role. Gender discrimination can also be a factor, but thank goodness, like race discrimination, it's become less so in our society. However, we'll never be able to eliminate it completely. The next factor is age, specifically as it relates to children. The percentage of children living in poverty is significantly higher than any other age group. And you may say, well, that makes sense from a pure percentage in numbers or mathematical standpoint, because children aren't of working age yet and they can't do anything for themselves specifically to lift themselves on their own efforts out of poverty. They're dependent upon what their parent situation might be and their family situation. But age does have a factor, play this factor in terms of the total numbers. Next, family struggles as it relates to family structures, divorce rates, and single parents trying to struggle on their own puts a lot of burden on the family structure, and the statistics show that this stresses the family and many times increases the potential for the family to fall into poverty. And the last factor is the economy and the way it works today. We face constant rapid economic shifts throughout our society because of a faster paced economy, and it regularly displaces limited skilled and limited education workers. The next thing I want to do is to give you some background that might prove helpful for when you enter into discussions over poverty. Discussions over poverty commonly lead to philosophical discussions over the topic of distribution of wealth. And there are two things you need to keep in mind as you enter into these types of discussions. The first is that poverty is a relative concept, meaning that it does not mean the same thing everywhere. I'll give you a very simple example. Somebody living at or below the poverty threshold in the United States is living at a higher standard of living than somebody that's living in poverty in another nation. In fact, there are some cases where people in the United States who are living at or below the poverty threshold have a higher standard of living than any people in other countries. So it's relative, so we need to keep that in mind. The second thing is that every economic system will contain poverty. Poverty cannot be eliminated, and there is no one economic system that has all the answers to eliminate challenges like poverty, like inflation, like unemployment, and so forth. As we leave talking about the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient and measurements in general, I want to make one last caution about especially the measurements of wealth and income, which are the most popular things to illustrate with the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient. The measurements produce spirited debate and have for a long time helped to drive suggestions about programs to redistribute both wealth and income to achieve equality. And I want to use, in terms of from a caution standpoint, I want to bring up a quote that helps to, I think, really summarize at a very high philosophical level why we should be cautious about how we use these measurements and for what purposes. And that quote is from Leonard Read: "Free people are not equal economically, and equal people are not economically free." So think about that and keep that tucked away in the back of your mind for when those philosophical discussions come up. And here are some additional specific cautions about programs to redistribute wealth or income to achieve equality. These programs reduce freedom, and as a result, they're generally inequitable. Second, they significantly reduce incentive throughout a society. And third, they'll result in lower economic growth and lower standards of living. In wrapping up this chapter, and particularly this section on poverty, I'm going to talk about 6 anti-poverty policies and programs. Here's the first. Housing subsidies. And we know from our past studies that subsidies are government payments to encourage a certain thing to happen or a particular group. So if we have people that are in search of affordable housing, whether it be through renting an apartment or maybe getting into their first home, that are struggling financially, need some help to get the affordable housing. Housing subsidies could be paid to the renter or maybe even the landlord or the person looking to buy a home, or to the bank to encourage lending to people within certain income categories. So housing subsidies are have the objective of helping people of lower incomes find affordable housing. The second program would be food stamps, and some of you or most of you probably have heard of food stamps before. People who are at a low income level might have a family struggling to make ends meet, as they say. These are government issued coupons that are usually targeted towards specific types of goods, food goods that is, that recipients exchange for the food. The third type of program is I think one of the most innovative government programs ever dreamed up. It really has a tremendous purpose because it really can help create jobs, and when you create jobs, people get employed and they get paid, and it raises people away from the poverty level. And that's the creation of enterprise zones within cities or territories. These are tax-free business zones that are designed to revitalize areas of low economic activity and drive employment. Many people would try to convince you that the minimum wage is an anti-poverty program. Based upon our studies and what we have seen of the data and the results and effects of the minimum wage in our country, I have some concerns over that. It really hasn't worked out to help young folks or the less educated and less skilled escape or put distance between themselves and the poverty threshold. The next anti-poverty program I want to mention is unemployment insurance. And I think we know how this works, and this is a good program. There are times where people lose their jobs because of economic shifts and so forth. We contribute into the unemployment insurance program in contributions throughout our normal pay. Makes a lot of sense and can help people through some tough times and avoid coming too close to that poverty threshold. And the sixth program I'd like to mention is the concept or programs of block grants. This is federal government aid money to states for local programs, such as the Workfare program, which was instituted during the Clinton administration, where we have work that's performed in exchange for temporary financial assistance. Now, most of these anti-poverty programs, certainly unemployment, workfare, these are what we call means-tested programs, meaning that you must meet some and prove some specific requirements to qualify. Food stamps also generally fall into that category of being means-tested as well. And what we mean by that is, do you have the means to specifically qualify based upon the requirements? And that brings us to the end of Chapter 14. We'll look forward to seeing you in Chapter 15 coming up next, which is all about macroeconomic measurements. See you there.